1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This just helps to project my voice to the computer there. So at any time, for you guys, for those of you that are watching the video, we have a massive crowd out here today, and I'm happy to be here. This thing on? So at any time, if you have any questions, just ask. So what I'll do is I'll just talk generally about why the first test step is so important, and that is to set parameters. So like if you think about human motion, some of the things, the easy ones, right? The 2-foot plus flexion, extension, flexion. But in real motion, real skill development, we have this combinational stuff that happens all the time, right? And the emphasis there is, if you have an Etch-a-Sketch, remember the little Etch-a-Sketch, you have the knobs? There's only 2 knobs, but I can make that little magnet move in a lot of different ways, right? I can make it do loop-de-loops, and those loop-de-loops are combinations of those independent knobs that go up, down, left, right. So one of the intents of kind of planes and axes as it deals with rotations is to show you that this with a combination of this is how we get this. And this with a combination of this and this is how we get this. It's not a separate dimension. It looks like it's its own dimension, but it's really just a combination of all those knobs moving at the same time. So it's to extract, just like you learn how to extract numbers in trigonometry, we need to learn how to extract what is sagittal from what is frontal. So when we do combinational things, we can say, okay, the sagittal component of this is flexion extension, and the frontal component of this is abduction and adduction. It's just that they're happening at the same time, so you get this combinational movement, but it's not something separate. It's just a blending of those different planes. Another thing from Aubrey, the athletic training background, is sometimes how we use sagittal, frontal, coronal, whatever you want to use, there'll be some confusion because we'll see, let's say we're looking at an MRI, or we're looking at an X-ray, or we're looking from a certain view. And the inference is we're looking at a sagittal view of something. And when you're looking at an MRI scan, it's not moving, it's not going anywhere, right? Or you're looking at a transverse slice. And so what that does is it plants the seed that, oh, transverse sagittal frontal is fixed. Okay? So what I'm trying to get you to see is, if we were going to dissect a cadaver, how would we get that transverse slice? We'd have to cut it, we'd have to spin, like imagine like a saw cutting through, and that saw is spinning in the transverse plane in order to cut through a transverse slice. So this is human movement. So how we're going to apply planes and axes has to involve rotation. So that's the emphasis there. I think that's why sometimes it gets confusing to people about planes and axes, because here's another way maybe I could try to say what I'm trying to say. If we were going to move something in a straight line, linearly, right? And I said, here is my phone, and I'm going to slide it across the table. Now, this phone sliding across the table is moving parallel with the ground, which maybe I think is transverse plane. But you know what else it's moving parallel to? The front wall. I mean, think about it. It's moving parallel with 2 dimensions. The only thing it's not moving parallel would be like if we had sidewalls, right? It would run into the sidewall. And it's the same thing if we made it go up and down. It's moving parallel with the sidewall and parallel with the front wall. And if we made it go front and back, now it would be moving parallel with the sidewall and the ground. So that's another way to look at how things can't translate in planes, because it would always be, I wouldn't be able to answer it because there would always be 2 right answers. But things rotate in planes. Things spin in rotational dimensions. an easy way to kind of separate three dimensions from linear and rotational is if something is moving in a straight line, it's going somewhere, right? It's moving and it's going somewhere. This phone, if I lift it up and down, it's moving and it's going somewhere. However, if I spin the phone, is it moving? Yeah, but is it going anywhere? You see the difference? Like, that's a big difference. If you're moving something linearly, it's moving and it's going somewhere. But if you're moving something purely rotational, like a merry-go-round, is the merry-go-round moving when it's spinning? Yes. Is it going anywhere? No. So it would be moving in a rotational dimension, but not a linear dimension. Make sense? And obviously, just like when I hinted about sagittal frontal combinational stuff, dimensions of motion have a lot of combinational things, combinations of linear and rotational. I use the analogy in my lectures about a car moving, right? The tires are moving rotationally, but they're also moving linearly, right? They're spinning and they're going somewhere. So how do we extract that? Oh, super simple. You know, we could say the tires are moving in the positive X direction, the negative X direction. We can give unto Caesar what is Caesar's. We could explain how the tires are moving linearly, and oh, by the way, the tires are spinning in this plane, that plane, depending on how we define our axes and our planes. So it doesn't have to be one or the other. You don't have to pick which restaurant you want to go to. You could go to multiple restaurants if you want. Right? It doesn't have to just be one or the other. And that's the trick with human motion. That's why I'm spending so much time on these basics. Because once we get into the knee and the hip and the shoulder and the wrist, yes, I know you guys have introduction to flexion, extension, ulnar radial activation. But what about when it's a combination of things? To be able to see when you're doing real world exercises or movements, I'm going to teach you how to pick out points and be like, okay, this is where I started, this is where I ended. I had to have this kind of motion to get there. And, there's a lot of subtleties. Like, for instance, when we get to the upper extremity, when you're doing like an upright row motion, it looks like your radial ulnar joint didn't go anywhere. But I started out in a prone position, but when I get here, my thumb is lateral. I'm in a supine position. I had to supinate when I went here in order to keep my fingers under the bar. If I didn't supinate and I stay prone, when I would do this is what would happen. I have to supinate in order to keep what I call your functional circle of grip. So those kind of things happen nuancely. It's like, I will say magic, but it's hard for the human eye to see. That's what I'm going to teach you, right? So that's why these planes and axes are so important to define and to be able to say, okay, this is the shoulder joint. The shoulder's triaxial. It can move in three dimensions. It has sagittal motion, it has frontal motion, it has transverse motion. But I know in the real world, it can move in all three as a combination, right? So what I have to do is have to pick out what was the sagittal component, what was the frontal component, what was the transverse component. Because the sagittal component has name options, the frontal component has name options, and the transverse component has name options. So, if I was just here's an analogy, if I was just comparing apples and oranges, if I was just in the sagittal plane, I would have apples. And if I was in the frontal, I'd have oranges. And if I was in the transverse, I'd have strawberries. What I'm trying to say is that human motion is a lot of fruit salad. it's a lot of combinations of apples, oranges, and strawberries. And my job is to teach you how to extract. Let me separate the strawberries, separate the apples, separate the oranges so that I can see, oh, that was a sagittal flexion component to this motion. And that was a frontal adduction component to that motion. And oh, I saw where he started here, he did that, so that had to be an external rotation. Right? But before we get into those kind of complex things, we got to start from the beginning. We got to start from basics. And I think where most people get sagittal, frontal, and transverse confused because in photos and in your book, rotation has to be applied. Like, it's just a still picture, right? And so I think one of the biggest misconceptions or traps is when people see, let me get to it right here. So you'll see this picture, and it'll say transverse plane. And they'll say, and technically this is true, right? In the transverse frontal sagittal, in terms of the Vitruvian man, cross in the center of mass. But that's just if the whole person is spinning, they have to spin about their center of mass. Like if the whole person did a front flip, the axis of rotation has to be about their center of mass. But guess what? I don't do any flips. Right? So if I'm just moving my shoulder, it's about the axes of the shoulder. And if I'm just moving my knee, it's about the axis of the knee. So a lot of times people will see that and say, well, transverse sagittal and frontal have to take place at those cross sections. No, that's just if the person's flipping around, if the person's doing a cartwheel, or if the person's doing a front roll, back roll, or if the person's doing a spin to your right, spin to your left. I can have those same 3 dimensions of spin here. I can have those same 3 dimensions of spin here. I can have those same 3 dimensions of spin anywhere that my body allows for it. Now, sometimes your joints only allow for certain rotations in certain planes. And when your joint rotates too much in a dimension that it's not allowed for, that's when we get injuries, right? And if you say, well, why wouldn't your body just allow for everything? Well, stability. If I'm going to cut and plant, I kind of don't want my knee to naturally give a lot in the front plane, right? I need it to be a kind of a rigid length, to be like, oh, I need you to be rigid here so that I can change the position. Right? So it's all based on how we're made. So that's a big trap where you need to apply spin. And the easiest way to apply spin is do things we're familiar with. Right? 3 dimensions, transverse plane, no problem. Spin to your right, spin to your left. Spin it. Merry-go-round. Sagittal plane, no problem. Front roll, back roll. Frontal plane, no problem. Cartwheel to your right, cartwheel to your left. And objects, when they're rotating in planes, must have an axis about which that rotation occurs in. They're married concepts. So any sagittal plane spin has to occur about a bilateral axis. And the easiest, I think I say this on video, you can actually walk down natural progression of how these things are named. Anterior posterior axis coming from the front to the back. AP axis. Bilateral axis, side to side. Polar axis from the top. So you define, where's the front of class? Well, this is the front of class. So an anterior posterior axis would make sense that it'd be coming from the front to the back, or the back to the front. And how can a tire spin about an axis like this? Frontal plane spin about an anterior posterior axis. Side to side, bilateral. That's what bilateral means, right? Both sides. So a side-to-side axis, if the axis is here, if I had a hula hoop in my arm, how would the hula hoop spin? Like this, right? Sagittal plane spin about bilateral axis. Polar axis, how would it spin? Transverse plane spin about polar axis. And then we get into perspectives, though, right? That if I said, on the count of 3, point to your right, 1, 2, 3, I'd do this and you do that, right? We point in 2 different directions, and we'd both be right. But if I said, on the count of 3, I define it. I say, this is the front of class, that's the back of class. Obviously, top and bottom are universal for everybody. But this is the right side of class, and this is the left side of class. Or I could have defined it, this is the right, and that's the whatever. But I defined it. I said, if class had a right and left arm, this would be the right and that would be the left. So if I defined it, and I said, okay, all right, let's point to the right side of class, we would both point in the same direction. That's a global reference. It's a global reference. And most of the time, these global references are found in our environment. Ground and gravity are universally global. Right? In other words, it doesn't matter where I see, point to the ground, we're all going to be pointing the same direction. Right? So ground and gravity kind of are globally referenced concepts. And there's other global references. When we get into biomechanics, you know, locally I can have a lot of different variability, but globally I have to have a release point in order for the ball to get to the catcher's net. I can't release it local however I want to. There's a certain point that I have to release it based off of ground and gravity, based on the environment around. So the concept here is that your sagittal could be my frontal, and that's okay. And why is this important? It's important because as athletic trainers, what do you want to be for a living? That's actually a good thing. No problem. But you want to help people in some capacity. So motion, movement, analyzation, rehab has to be from their perspective. It's their right, their left, because you're working with them. Right? Sometimes coaches have a problem. I say have a problem. If you've only dealt with mostly right-handed people, that's one reason why sometimes it's tricky to work with left-handed people, because it's that mirror opposite, right? I remember one time when I was a kid trying to learn how to play golf, and I was a left-hander, so the coach kept giving me advice as a right-hander would see it. And it was actually the opposite of advice for what a left-hander needed. And so I kept, and then I would talk to it. It wasn't his fault, I was just real bad. So perspective matters. Your sagittal, if you nod your head in your sagittal, could be my frontal, right? Because I see spin like this. It's Halloween season, so if you did a magic trick and your head rolled off and rolled in front of me, I'd be like, wow, look at that head roll in my frontal plane. But it'd be your sagittal. There's nothing wrong with that. Here's the key, though. That's why we define things. That's why we're good communicators. You know, you saw this, I saw that. In the human body, just like in sport, we have different levels of perception. We have players' perception. Coach, I'm open on this route. You know, all the wide receivers are always open, right? That's the rule. You know, but then you have coaches who have perspectives. But then there's another perspective. What do the fans see, right? What do the people in the stands see? It's kind of like that in the human body. The global reference is, you know, if I'm a fan and I'm in my seat, I'm going to see the same thing no matter how the players are moving around. This is always going to be, you know, the left, the right, the front, the back, the up, the down. And obviously, this means I stay in my seat. So the global reference analogy is how the crowd sees the game. The local reference of your eyes is like how the coach sees the game, right? Because the joints are the players. The joints are the players. And some players have specialties, right? Kickers are specialists, and three-point shooters might be specialists. Well, you have some joints that are very specialized. And then you have other joints who are like superstars, right? And so you have different levels. Globally, how does the outside environment see me move? Locally, how does my coach, my brain, see these motions? So my brain sees my elbow rotate in my sagittal, but if I turn my head this way, my brain now sees my elbow rotating in my frontal. But the player of my elbow is like, dude, I was doing the same thing the whole time, right? I was still moving in my sagittal. That's okay. Player, you could see something different than the coach. There's nothing wrong with that. But local references to the joints are important because that explains why flexion, extension of the elbow is the same whether you see it like this, or like this, or like that. In other words, even though I move it globally, it's the same motions locally because from the perspective of that elbow, it's like, dude, I'm doing the same thing. The elbow doesn't see the room, right? The elbow just knows to flex and extend. So that's going to actually help us when we're looking at these kind of confusing, tricky motions. And it's going to be like, don't pay attention to how it looks differently globally. It's happening the same from the joint's perspective. That's why we call it the same. Okay? So perspective, that's why I introduce you to perspective. It's to help explain why joint motions are similar regardless of global position. Do you have any questions? Say it again. You're 415? 415 is at April. Did I not put that in the email? It's the copy and paste. But let me ask you this. It really doesn't matter because to answer your question, yes, the first 415 test is going to be regenerative. So you're going to have to know muscles and function. And so that way we can get into individual muscles and function. Maybe I didn't. That's the beauty of having this lesson. So we were both right and we were both wrong. But there is going to be pre-10 review. So motions, right? That's important. Because if we're going to get into specific muscles, like, and this review is actually good too, because it's all the same concepts of planes and axes go into muscles. So I'll just give you an example. I'm going to teach you about the tensor fascia muscle. Right? And some people may say, well, to know a function of a muscle, you just need to know origin insertion. Not necessarily true. Origin insertion is important, especially when you're dealing with injuries and palpations. But specifically to a muscle's function, what does it do is how does it cross? If I have a muscle that crosses in the front of my hip, it's going to pull in the direction of flexion. If I have a muscle that crosses in the back of my hip, it's going to pull in the direction of extension, right? Outside, inside, you get the concept. So sometimes you have these muscles who aren't very clear how they cross, especially when you get to oblique angulation, right? So the tensor fascia lata is like a pocket muscle, and it crosses the hip. A component of it crosses anteriorly, so it's going to have a flexion pull. Laterally, it's going to have an abduction pull, and it runs in a way that it pulls in a direction of internal rotation. So reviewing those planes and axes are really important when we get into specific muscles, so that you can be able to see the component of that muscle's pull, like the anterior delt. Anterior, it's going to pull this way. Laterally, it's going to pull this way, and transversely, it's going to pull that way. So you have some easy muscles that just have one direction pull, but you got some complex muscles, especially some that can switch function based on your position. So like when you're below 90 degrees, your pec major pulls down in the direction of abduction. When you're past 90 degrees, it pulls up in the direction of abduction. The pec's just trying to pull your arm to your trunk. Down here, the path of least resistance is this. Up here, the path of least. So I'm hoping it's not a total waste of your time. We're just kind of reviewing planes and axes. Introduction for the 310, but review for the 415. So there's a lot of crossover. Aubrey, do you have any questions?
No, I'm not.
So then we get into how do we communicate motion? What you see as motion is really your brain doing a flip book of fixed pictures. Like your brain takes individual snapshots and then blends it into a flip book of motion. Movies are like that too. Like it's just individual frames that they do real fast and we see motion. So we infer motion in this class two different ways. And it's going to be the same for 415, inferring motion with muscles, right? This exercise, I start here, I do this, or from this position, you observe extension. It's the same concepts, just what level of the staircase we're at, okay? So we can infer, I don't like to use the word assume, motion two different ways. And that is a before and after picture. So I start on the left and I go from there to there, right? So if I said I started in Lafayette and I ended in Lake Charles, you know I had to travel west to get there. It's inferred because you know where you started, you know where you went. So if I start here and I do this, you know that I had to have shoulder flexion to get there. And remember in the lectures, we always talk about anatomical position. Sometimes we might talk about fetal, but you know what we usually never talk about? How do you have to move to get there? Flexion, absolutely. That's the magic of flexion. Flexion creates fetal. Extension gets you out of fetal. So finger flexion, wrist flexion, elbow flexion, shoulder flexion. See, ESPN has been lying to you guys already. Right? Full extension. Well, maybe for your elbow, but your shoulder had to flex. Think about it. If you were going to get into a ball, right, to protect yourself, you know what you wouldn't do? Heads up. Oh my God. Here. And it follows the path of the hip. Hip flexion, shoulder flexion. Okay. So where did I start? Where did I finish? Start, finish, right shoulder flexion. If I say right to left, start, finish, right shoulder extension. Now, how can we infer motion from one fixed photo? Super easy. We use anatomical position. So, let's say Lafayette is home. Okay? I know Rain's home and Zachary is home, but let's say, since we're coming to school here, Lafayette's home. East and west are relative concepts. Lafayette is east of Lake Charles, but it's west of Baton Rouge. So it's both, but it can't be one or the other without context. Compared to what? Reference to what? So if Lafayette is our home, so is anatomical position our home. Okay? So if I say, what is the position of my shoulder? Well, I know it's not home. I know it's not Lafayette. I mean, it's not Lafayette. So where is it at? Well, I am flexed because I have something to compare it to. I went in a motion of flexion from anatomical position. So therefore, I am flexed. I'm in a flexed position. 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 So how do you differentiate all those different flexed positions? Degrees. I'm flexed 5 degrees, I'm flexed 10 degrees, I'm flexed 90 degrees, right? I have 80 degrees of flexion to be flexed 80 degrees. So, if I have this picture and I say, I went from anatomical to this position, well, you already know the story. So, if I say, here's my position, how did I have to move to get there if I started in anatomical? You know I had to have flexion to get there. And if I say, if I start in this position and I start moving to anatomical, I start moving back home. I mean, think about it, it's no different than Lafayette. Lafayette is home. I'm in Lake Charles. How did I have to move to get there? I had to go west. Okay, you're in Lake Charles. How would you have to move to go home? I'd have to go east. It's the same. Right? Movement towards anatomical position from there would have to be right shoulder extension. Okay. Okay, what do you want to call it? What does your intuition want to call it?
Abduction.
Abduction?
Yeah, I don't know why.
No. Hey, it's all good. That's very logical. Okay? So remember, abduction is a frontal plane concept, right? So here, we're sagittally spinning. So one way to look at it is, I don't have that as an option in the sagittal plane. Does that make sense? Sagittal plane, think of it like this. A clock has two different ways it can spin, clockwise and counterclockwise, right? So think of it as having 3 unique clocks. Sagittal, clockwise and counterclockwise. I have to call it two different things for two different spins. Flexion, extension, clockwise, counterclockwise. Now, I can take my clock and put it on a different wall. And when I take my clock and put it on a different wall, I still have clockwise and counterclockwise, right? Add, 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 Then I can take my clock and lay it on the ground and have two different ways of spinning. Clockwise, counterclockwise, internal, external, medial, lateral, right? So the reason it can't be ab or add is because my clock isn't in the direction of ab and add, right? It's a great question. It's a great question. So, anatomical position. This, I'm in an extended position. And here's the key. Just like Lafayette is home, anatomically, and I can travel east from Lafayette, or I can travel west from Lafayette. Flexion from anatomical, extension from anatomical. Then I can turn around and travel west to Lafayette, or I can travel east to Lafayette. Flexion to anatomical, extension to anatomical. It's the same concept of traveling the roads. So here's how we would explain a full range of motion. Let's say I'm in an extended position at the end of my range of motion. Flexion to anatomical, flexion from anatomical. Extension to anatomical, extension from anatomical. Yeah. Extended, flexed. Extended 10 degrees from anatomical, extended 20 degrees from anatomical, extended 40 degrees from anatomical. How do you do it? Sorry about that. Cool. So let's look at this one. What's the position of the knees? Well, we know that position is relative to anatomical. Well, those knees aren't straight, so I must be more in fetal position in that picture. My knees are flexed. Now, in terms of motion, well, I got to give it context. I have no idea if he's doing this or if he's doing that. But on the test, if I say his knees from that position start moving towards anatomical position, they start to move back home. They go back home. He would have to have me, yes ma'am, the extension. Towards home, going back home, you'd have to have extension. And if I say from that position, he moves more away from anatomical position, right? He's away from anatomical, but just like Baton Rouge is east of Lafayette, I could go further. I could go to Mobile and be even further east. East is east, but there's a continuum there. Ah, what a great question. So from here, if he goes away from anatomical, he would just still have flexion. Hyper. Think about someone who's hyperactive, beyond normal activity, right? Hypertrophy, beyond normal. Hyperventilation, above normal. Hyper, in terms of motion and position, is beyond normal.
So if you straight out of line,
Yeah, that would be hyperextension, beyond normal. Yeah. So that's why what we don't say is extension to anatomical, hyperextension from anatomical. That's normal motion for me. Hyperextension would be like right, going beyond. And it follows very simple rules. Well, what if I started by doing this? Extension, flexion, hyperflexion? No. And what about side to side? Right lateral, left lateral, hyper left lateral? Like it doesn't make sense. It's above and beyond. Now, that in itself has relative and absolute components. So what I mean by that is normal range of motion, your shoulder does this, this, and this, right? Hyper would be beyond normal. What if I'm super tight? What if I'm doing rehab and my hamstrings are super duper tight? So hyper to me might be normal for you. That's okay. That's okay. But hyper means what it means, excessive, beyond normal. You can have hyperflexion if you fall on your wrist and it goes beyond normal. You could have an injury because of hyperflexion.
You have-
100%. You could have hyperabduction, you could have hyper anything. But the key point is that it's beyond normal range of motion.
And like when you say local, just that means like, basically anytime we're looking at what it is, we give it that specific.
100%. We analyze motion joint by joint. And that is going to allow us to not be confused. So when the Matrix had a trailer that came out and, you know, all these motions, that could be overwhelming. Or a chef, you know, if I'm an untrained person in food, which I am, and I just taste all these kind of flavors all happening. But a trained chef would be like, I taste this ingredient, that ingredient. He can separate, he can extract, she can extract. We need to be chefs of the human body. We need to be able to see complex stuff and realize that's just a combination of very basic motion options at the wrist, the elbow, or the elbow joint, the shoulder, the scapula, whatever. And I'm going to take all of that complex stuff and say, what did the wrist do? What did the elbow do? What did the shoulder do? What did the scapula do?
So like in that example of the elbow, which
If I start here and I do this, the elbow didn't do anything. It stayed in the same position. It stayed in its anatomical. See, anatomical position isn't all or nothing. I mean, you can define it like that, right? My body is in anatomical position. But if I do this, guess what? My wrist is still in the same position. My elbow is still in the same position. My shoulder's not. But guess what? My elbow doesn't care what my shoulder's doing. Just like my mom used to say, it don't matter what your brother's doing. So individual joints can still be in their anatomical position. 100%. You know, if I think of it like this, if I had a halo that prevented me from moving my neck, right?
would still be.
Yes,
That's the point.
exactly. And that's really important because what I'm going to try to teach you guys down the road is to not be trapped by global references. So maybe in an undergraduate class, and I'm not dissing the undergraduate, but you got to be introduced to this stuff some kind of way. My job is to develop and take it to the next level. Let's say you're in a class, and they say when you look to your left, that's left transverse cervical rotation. But that's all you ever get. Well, there's a lot of different ways I can look to my left. I can literally move my cervical vertebra, but guess what? I can move my trunk and not move my cervical vertebra. Guess what? I can move my pelvis about my hips and not move my cervical vertebra. So if you learn these motions based on global references, look to your left, look to your right, arm goes up, arm goes down, Super Bowl, right? That's going to lead to trouble because there's a lot of different ways to do those global tasks that do not involve those motions. Yeah. So my job is to try to teach you guys to see those motions for actually what they're happening. And moving on to the neck is to teach you that, yes, this is left transverse, but you know what else is left transverse? This. And you know what's not left transverse? This.
So what would that,
This.
the third one, like when you do your,
This. That'd be left transverse pelvic girdle rotation because of left hip internal rotation, right hip external rotation. But we're going to get there. We're going to get there. Literally, my hips did this. My hips went from anatomical position to rotating. I'm going to teach you that. I'm going to teach you that. But you know what it's not? It's not left transverse cervical rotation just because I look to my head. That's what I need to wash you guys out of, is that this motion is when I see something. Because sometimes there's motion and you didn't see anything. It's an illusion. But think about it. If I go from here to there, it's the same as if I had the halo on, then I took the halo off, and then I went to my left. That's how I know I had left transverse cervical rotation, when I went from here to there. Or another way to look at it is, wouldn't you agree that my cervical vertebra is anatomical? Yeah? Okay? Well, it's not an anatomical anymore, right? So how would I have to move to go home? Wouldn't I have to look to the right to go home. So that meant I had to look to the left to leave home. I'm going to teach you those things. I'm going to teach you those concepts. It's all good. It's all good. So, wrapping up here, for those of you listening at home, watch the videos, but more importantly, hit me up if we need to clarify things, right? Hit me up if you have questions. And remember, you can always practice this stuff. If you're awake, you're probably moving. And if you're moving, you can practice things like the door opens in what plane. Well, what if I lay down on my side? How would I see the door? Oh, now I'd see sagittal. How could I see it frontal? Like just little games like that that you can play as you're awake. If you're working out, man, there's a lot of different ways you can practice planes and axes. Okay? But I think today was great because we put into context why these foundations are so important. Okay? Why these foundations are so important.
Yeah, it's not.
Cool? All right. Yeah, have a good day. That was helpful. Man, that was the first time I actually talked in front of people in a year and a half.